In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Magic Dragon Knight build, which is a level 150 version of the Dragon Knight build that sort of continues the similar playstyle of using dragon spells primarily to absolutely melt bosses from a distance. So first up, let's talk about the weapon I'm using for this build. I am using the Ripple Blade. This is an axe that scales with Arcane, has S scaling Arcane, does pretty good damage with this build because we have a lot of Arcane. You can do block counters with it effectively. We're actually using a Talisman that boosts block counter damage. Because we are using a Great Shield, enemies tend to rebuff off that shield, making block counters very easy to do, and it hits very, very hard because of the amount of Arcane that we have. This weapon isn't mandatory for this build. You can actually use any weapon that you want that has Arcane scaling. I like that this weapon is very light, only weighs 4.5, does really good damage for that, and I typically haven't really used axes in any other build, so I kind of like to use one here as well. Besides this, we use the Dragon Communion Seal. Obviously, this scales very well with Arcane, boosts dragon spell damage. We use a lot of dragon spells with this build, so it's a natural fit for this build. We are still using the Jellyfish Shield. As I mentioned, it's very good for block counters because enemies rebuff off it. It doesn't have the greatest guard boost at like 60 or so fully upgraded, meaning that you're not going to block like huge hits with it, but regular enemies you can get block counters off, making it very easy to deal with that. And what we're really using this shield for, of course, is the Contagious Fury ability, which boosts all of your damage by 20% for 30 seconds. This is going to include all your melee damage as well as your spells. So when we go to use our dragon buff spells, they're going to get that extra damage from the Dragon Communion Seal and the extra damage from the shield at the same time. When it comes to armor for this build, I'm using the Silver Tear Mask. The reason for that is that this increases your Arcane by +8. We have a lot of demand on our stats for this build, so getting extra points where we can is huge. It does reduce your melee damage a little bit, but it's not substantial. As far as other armor I'm going for this build, I have just like the Banished Knight set here. It doesn't really matter what armor you use. I'm going for something that has significant poise in it. If you could get better poise, it'd be better if you had more endurance. We just don't have the stats for it right here. And that's because you don't want to be interrupted when doing your dragon spells, if possible. You want to be able to like tank through them in some cases. You're going to be trying to do them from far enough away that you shouldn't get hit, but nonetheless, you don't want to be interrupted if you can help it. When it comes to talismans for this build, I have the Phlox Canvas Talisman, the Curved Sword Talisman, the Ritual Sword Talisman, and Magic Scorpion Charm. Phlox Canvas Talisman increases your incantation damage by about 8%. This is really good for this build. Your spells are going to hit very, very hard, and you want them to hit as much damage as possible, so we take this one here. The Curved Sword Talisman is here because you do a lot of block counters with this build, and you actually do a lot more damage than you would think. You get around 12 to 1300 damage on a block counter with this setup, which is a lot for a one-handed axe. So it just further boosts that damage, making those hit very, very hard, so you can use those to great effect. Ritual Sword Talisman boosts your total damage by 10% when at full health. The idea here being that you're going to, nuke bosses and tough enemies from range before they ever get to you, or you're going to block counter them and, just take them out in one hit or, hit stagger critical attack combo when never taking damage ideally. And lastly, I'm using Magic Scorpion Charm. This is to boost our magic damage by a further 10%. I find that Smaragd's Glintstone Breath is probably the spell I use the most with this build, which is why I have it slotted as Magic Scorpion Charm by default. However, you can swap this to the fire version if you're going to be using something like a Gil's Flame if you're fighting an enemy group or a boss that's specifically weak to fire damage. So you can swap back and forth between those as necessary, but I feel like Smaragd's Glintstone Breath is the one you're going to be using more often than not, which is why I have it listed as the default one here. When it comes to spells, we have Golden Vow, which boosts our overall damage by 15% and increases our defenses by 10% in this last 90 seconds. It's really, really good. This is going to boost your attack and your spells, which is fantastic. Next up, we have Smaragd's Glintstone Breath. This is the shining star of this build, in my opinion. This is the spell you're going to be using the most. A lot of enemies are weak to magic damage, or let's say not as resistant to magic damage. It does insane damage with this build. And it's just better than Borealis' Mist in a lot of cases. Borealis' Mist costs more FP. Of course, it can set the Frostbite status effect, which is great, but a lot of times you'll just outright kill enemies or even bosses in some cases before you ever set that Frostbite status effect. So I find that Borealis' Mist is better in circumstances where enemies have huge health bars like big dragon bosses or like the Fire Giant, some of these cases where you set that Frostbite status effect at the beginning of the fight and you still have a long way to go, and then the enemy is less resistant to your attacks and your spells afterward. But just generally speaking, you can nuke most enemies or tough enemies with Smaragd's Glintstone Breath a lot more effectively, and it costs less FP. Gil's Flame is there to give you a fire version of these type of spells for those circumstances where fire is a more effective damage type. I feel like this is a little less frequently than Smaragd's Glintstone Breath, but when you're using fire in an area or against a boss, you're going to want to swap out the Magic Scorpion Charm for the fire version to boost your fire damage by 10%. And lastly, we have Exike's Decay, which sets the Scarlet Rot status effect and does physical damage. It's not going to be benefited by the Magic Scorpion Charm or Fire Scorpion Charm, so you may want to replace this if you end up using this spell more frequently than the others, although I just generally find its damage is subpar compared to these other spells, so I don't use it that frequently. I feel like Exike's Decay is best used in fights where the enemy has a huge health pool, where you want to set that Scarlet Rot early on, or maybe an enemy that's dangerous to get close to, and you just want to get that damage from range, or maybe they're, resistant to fire or magic damage and you want to deal some physical damage. That's probably where you'll use this spell. So this build works similarly to the Dragon Knight build. Obviously, we're going to buff with Golden Vow as we go around the landscape to increase our damage and defenses, and we'll use Contagious Fury as necessary to further increase our damage. It only costs 9 FP, so you can use this constantly, and you'll block counter enemies or just attack them with jumping attacks with your axe, and pull out your breath spells as needed when you're fighting like a big group of enemies or a tough enemy from range to soften them up or outright kill them. Chug a blue potion and continue on your way. When you get to bosses, things change up a little bit. Obviously, you're still going to buff with Golden Vow and Contagious Fury, but you're going to select the spell and Magic Scorpion Charm or Fire Scorpion Charm, depending on which breath attack you're going to use, and you're going to sort of judge by the weakness of the enemy. So if you're fighting like a dragon that's resistant to fire, for instance, then you may want to use magic damage. But I generally default, again, to Smaragd's Glintstone Breath. I feel like this is the highest damage of these spells just because of the way resistances work. And what you want to do is you want to use the Cerulean Hidden Tier and your Magic Flask along with the one Magic Shrouding Tier that increases your magic damage. Buff with these, buff with a potion, and then hold down that breath spell to not even use any FP for the first 10 seconds and try and rip off as much health off a boss as you can from distance before you ever get into melee range. And, you really don't want to melee in boss fights with this build if you can help it. The melee attack range of your axe is quite short. Sometimes it's very difficult. You can't always block, counter big enemies and things like that. So you really want to rely on your breath spells in order to wipe out bosses, by holding that thing down and just nuking them as much as you can. And even trading damage sometimes, because you have high health and because you have decent armor, you can sometimes just tank the hit and just keep on spewing Dragon Breath. When it comes to stats for this build, I have 40 Vigor, 22 Mind, 27 Endurance, 20 Strength, 14 Dexterity, 9 Intelligence, 25 Faith, and 80 Arcane. So 40 of Vigor is not as much as I would like. You are primarily a spellcaster with this build, even though you have a shield, and even though you have a weapon, even though you have heavy armor, you are focusing, especially on boss fights, the hard parts of the game as a spellcaster, and we really can't justify any more points here in order to meet the requirements for everything else. So 40 is about as high as we can get it. I'd like to have more. If you take this build higher, you'll definitely want to increase your Vigor. When it comes to Mind, I wish we had more Mind here. 22 Mind isn't a ton. However, when you go into boss fights, you are going to be using the Cerulean Hidden Tier for that first bit, and that should usually get you about half a boss's health bar down in a lot of cases, or close to it. So you don't use as much FP as you think you would, and when you're out on the landscape, you're not just chucking breath spells left and right, you're using them selectively in certain areas. So you can get away with lower FP here. When it comes to endurance, again, we have just enough in order to medium roll, but I would like to have more here in order to wear even heavier armor with more poise. That way you can tank even more hits while continuing your breath spells, not unlike the Dragon Warrior build, so that you can really, just shrug off an attack and just keep on melting bosses whether you take damage or not. So I would highly suggest if you take this build higher, you increase Vigor to at least 50, you increase Mind probably to at least 30, and you increase Endurance to like 35, 36, something like that. So you'd want to increase all three of those stats. 20 Strength and 14 Dexterity are simply there in order to meet the requirements of the Jellyfish Shield. Again, this gives you a great shield that makes it easier for block countering and gives you that plus 20% damage when you buff with Contagious Fury, which is why we use it. We don't need any Intelligence for this build, and 25 Faith is there in order to meet the requirements for Golden Vow, but also you need like 23 Faith-ish for most of these spells anyway, so you're going to have some points in Faith. Taking it up a couple more points to get Golden Vow is a no-brainer. And lastly, we have 80 Arcane, which is there to not only increase the damage of your weapon that has S scaling in Arcane, so these points are not wasted. It's also there to increase the damage of your spells as much as possible, so you get double whammy out of these, which is great. And you really don't need to take this up any higher. The diminishing returns significantly drop off from this point forward, which is why I recommend if you're taking this build higher, you increase Vigor, Mind, and Endurance and really shore up those, because the playstyle is still going to work very effectively. It'll just be more effective if you have more health, more, FP to play around with, and you can tank more hits. That wraps up our Magic Dragon Knight video. I already explained the Flask of Wondrous Physique to you, so you should know you're going to use the Cerulean Hidden tier and the Magic Shrouding tier in order to just rip off huge chunks of health without using any FP right at the beginning of a lot of boss fights. And stay tuned for more builds. We still have a lot more 150 builds I feel like we can do before we move on to 200, so stay tuned for those.